You're here, one of the first people here to vote.
Well, I woke up this morning and I was just like, I got to make sure I get out and vote today. Really just use that right. Before I wasn't going to vote, but a lot of my friends were just like, get out and vote, man. Like, this is important. This was big. So I'm excited. I know I was going to feel this good walking out after I voted, so.
That was Tye Ridley. He's a 25-year-old voter in the crucial swing state of Georgia. And this morning, on Election Day, he was talking to my colleague, Holly Bailey, about his decision to vote for Vice President Kamala Harris. Some 80 million people have already voted early, but lots more are casting ballots today. Post reporters and producers are out all over the country capturing the moment, trying to understand how people are feeling in this historic election.
I'm really anxious. I've been nauseous for the last 2 days over all of this stuff.
My main concern is actually people getting to the polls and not feeling intimidated. Among my friends, I told them, hey, if you're going to go vote, double it up, go together, just to be safe.
Between you and me, I think the country's on the edge of something. And I think we're at risk of losing everything if the Democrats take over.
The race is incredibly close. That's what all the polls tell us. It's likely to be decided by voters in 7 battleground states, including Pennsylvania. Outside of a polling center, our producer talked to Santo Montecalvo. He's 73 and lives in South Philly.
Yeah, I'm a registered Democrat, been all my life. But it's time for change. Foods cost so much. I got kids' college tuitions I got to pay. It just can't make ends meet. Look, I don't like everything Trump does. I don't think anybody does. But when he was president, I had money in my pocket. So, it's simple.
We also heard from Heather Brann, a South Philly resident who came to vote in person. She brought her daughter to show her what voting looks like. The daughter was wearing these cute earrings that looked like voting stickers.
There's so many great reasons to vote for Kamala Harris. She, against all odds, always comes back to, we're in this together. I'm here for the people, all of the people. And I think that positive message is really the grounding force of our nation. And we have to continue to come back to that.
From what we know, it could be days before we find out who the next president will be. And some of these voters are just trying to live in that uncertainty.
I'm not going to worry about it if I can't change it. It's going to happen the way it's going to happen. And I'm going to cast my vote, and that's how it's going to go.
What are you going to do to watch the results tonight? Are you somebody who's going to watch them come in? You're going to kind of check
I quit drinking, so I can't do that.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Tuesday, November 5th. Happy Election Day. As people are out casting their vote around the country, our reporters are also preparing for the aftermath of this unprecedented election.
This is Yvonne Winget Sanchez in downtown Phoenix. I just finished getting set up at the media tent outside of Maricopa County's Vote Tabulation Center, which was the site of protests after the 2020 election as votes were still being tabulated. This year, this center is protected like a fortress with concrete barricades.
Hi, this is Josh Dawsey. I'm a reporter for The Washington Post. I'm here in a gym in Palm Beach, Florida, where we're waiting on former President Trump to come and vote. I've been covering the former president for 8 years, and today feels like sort of like an end of an era, maybe a beginning of a new one. It's hard to know.
That's one thing we all share right now. It's hard to know what this moment means, and none of us know what's going to happen next. But today, we are here to help you understand the election results that you might be seeing later tonight. There are 538 electoral votes up for grabs today. The crucial number is 270. Whoever wins enough states to get there will win the presidency. So in this episode, we are mapping out the most likely paths to victory for Harris and for former President Donald Trump. We're talking to my colleague, Aaron Blake, to game this all out. He is the host of the Campaign Moment podcast. Listeners will be familiar with his voice because we have him on the roundtable that we air on Fridays. And today, he is our election guide. So, Aaron, I'm hoping you can start by just walking through what we can expect on Tuesday night in terms of what, if any, results we are actually going to hear about.
Well, the short answer is that unless it is a decisive result, which is not what we're seeing in the polls right now, you'd best settle in because it could take a few days. That's what happened in 2020. Some of these states take a while to count their ballots. Some of them can't count ballots that are cast by mail until Election Day. And so we have a situation in which we're probably not going to know for a little while unless we get a result that really surprises us all. And it looks like one of the candidates is going to win this in a very decisive race.
So it sounds like you're making the case for not necessarily like people feeling like they need to stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning to watch this, because from what we're seeing, that it's likely that that is not going to be when we're hearing the final result.
Yeah, I think if you're looking for a decisive result, you might want to not stay up too late. But I think we will get a good sense of which direction things are headed in, because we may not have complete results. It may not be the kind of results that allow for a given state to be called, but we will get substantial results in all of these swing states as of late Tuesday night, early Wednesday morning. And at that point, we'll be able to get a sense for how long this could be drawn out.
Okay. So let's walk people through that, like some of the scenarios that could start to play out even on Tuesday night that would give a sense of potential paths to victory for Harris or for Trump. You have been laying out a lot of these scenarios in some of your pieces. They're very interesting to think about, but I do want to start out by talking about what I think you've termed as the Harris squeaker, which is a great name. Can you explain what that is and what it looks like if Harris is squeaking by?
Yeah, I want to start out by just emphasizing that this could go any number of different directions. We could have a very close election where it comes down to one or two states. The races are so close that if things shift a couple points one direction or another, we could see all of the swing states going one direction or another. So we just have a lot of scenarios that are in play. I think the one that, if you believe the polls right now, if the polls are spot on, the most likely scenario that we're seeing right now is what I called the Harris squeaker. And that is Kamala Harris is effectively elected president because she wins the three northern swing states. Those are Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
And then this is what people are referring to when they refer to the blue wall,
blue
correct?
wall, yes. This is, Democrats have been calling it this since when President Joe Biden was in the race, because this seemed like their most significant and most likely path to victory, because these northern swing states were polling better for the Democrats than these southern swing states that we're going to talk about. And the reason this is plausible is because Harris has at least a slight lead in all three of these states. And also, by the way, these three states, if she wins them, as long as she carries Nebraska's 2nd district, which is something we're going to get to, I imagine, she gets to exactly 270 electoral votes. So she doesn't need anything else besides these three states and that Nebraska electoral vote. And so I think it's the simplest.
And to be clear, 270, like that's the number that either of them need. So if she gets 270, she's getting there, but like truly by the skin of her teeth.
Exactly, yes. 270 electoral votes. You need a majority of electoral votes. And there are paths for each candidate by which they can get there with just three states. And this is Harris's plausible one, and the one that the polls suggest is quite possible in a very close election.
But I want to go back to what you just said. So it's Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. If Harris wins those three states, then she's in a good place. But she still has to win a congressional district in Nebraska. We talked about this a little bit on the campaign moment on Friday, but I want to dive into more of that because I think a lot of people have been paying attention to swing states, and Nebraska has not come up in this at all.
Yeah, Nebraska is one of these two states, Nebraska and Maine are the two of them, in which they award electoral votes to the winner of each congressional district. So the winner statewide gets 2, and the winner of each congressional district gets 1 for each of those districts. And so Nebraska's 2nd district is the state's one swing district, and it's one that Democrats have done increasingly well in recent years. And so A lot of people assume that it is going to go for Harris because it's been trending in that direction, because we're seeing polls that show her up by the high single digits, even double digits. But you don't know. We don't have a ton of polling here. Unexpected things can happen. But this is why you saw the Trump campaign try and get Nebraska to change to a winner-take-all electoral vote system, because this is a potentially very significant single electoral vote just because of how the paths to victory shake out.
Wow. Amazing. Okay, so I want to move on from the Harris squeaker to then talk about the Trump squeaker. Tell me about what that scenario looks like that you've mapped out.
Yeah, so I think Donald Trump's paths to victory are a little bit less obvious, even if they're not necessarily fewer of them. One of them is going to run along the East Coast, and this is one that his campaign has focused on since a couple of months ago, basically winning Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia. This is the path by which Trump can also win the Electoral College with exactly 270 electoral votes. If you give him those 3 states, it goes to exactly 270. And this has been maybe a little bit of a tougher path than that Northern Harris path that we've talked about, because it looked like Pennsylvania was favoring Harris slightly. But that state, according to the most recent polls, looks like it's closing a little bit. So this path to victory for Donald Trump is looking a little bit more plausible than it did before.
Well, what's interesting is that in both of these quote-unquote squeaker scenarios, that it relies on Pennsylvania. And Aaron, you talked earlier about our expectations that we're not going to hear about every state's results on Tuesday night. Pennsylvania is chief among them, in which we're going to be waiting around for a little while to figure out what actually happened there.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a big reason why this election is probably going to take a few days if it's close. Pennsylvania is just... It's the most important swing state by far, I would say. It has the most electoral votes. It is maybe the closest, according to the Washington Post polling averages right now. It's kind of mixed in with a couple others, but it's very, very close. Unless we have a very decisive race, it's going to be a situation where we're waiting for Pennsylvania to be called in order for us to be able to determine any kind of winner.
I also want to talk about another scenario that you've mapped out, and that involves a sweep of essentially Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina. Talk a little bit about that and what happens in that scenario.
Yeah, so I was talking about how Harris and Biden before her seem to be polling better in these northern states, the blue wall states. Well, the opposite has been true along the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt states we're talking about are Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. And we've seen pretty much consistently throughout this race that Trump has pulled a very slight lead in those states. So this is a plausible path to victory for him. The one thing that really complicates it for him is that those 4 states, even if he swept all 4 of them, would not be sufficient for him because they have fewer electoral votes. So even if he pulls off that Sun Belt sweep, he needs to win one of those northern states in order to get to 270 electoral votes, which, raises all kinds of questions about what state that would be. But, I think the main point is that the Sun Belt could prove a significant base of support for Donald Trump on his path to victory.
And then I think it's important to talk about the possibility where you have a Harris route or a Trump route, that there is a decisive and relatively quick victory for one of the candidates. Can you talk a little bit about the possibility of a overall sweep by either of these candidates and how we would be able to tell if that's happening?
Yeah, I mean, the $64,000 question is whether the polls are off right now, because they have been off in the past. They underestimated Donald Trump in both 2016 and in 2020. And so you have a lot of Republicans believing that that's happening again and he's going to do better than they suggest. It is a situation, though, where the polls don't have to be off by that much for either candidate to win this race in a rout. The Washington Post polling averages have every one of these 7 swing states separated by 2 points or less. The margin of error in these polls is generally about 4 points. So these don't even have to be off outside the margin of error in order for this to be a very different race one way or another. And I think it's very much within the realm of possibility that we see one of these candidates win 6 or even all of these swing states, which is something that my colleague Lenny Bronner wrote about in recent days. So I'd encourage people to check that out. I need to emphasize that even if somebody sweeps all 7 of these states, it's not like it would be a landslide election. It would just be a very close election that broke one way or another in a very decisive way.
And I just want to talk about this route possibility for 1 second more, because we've seen some polling in the last couple of days that have gotten Democrats in particular excited that, like, maybe there is a route to come for Kamala Harris. And specifically, this is a poll from Iowa, which was confusing to me because obviously Iowa is typically considered a red state and is not on the list of swing states that we've been paying attention to. I mean, in my mind, Iowa kind of ceases to be relevant, like directly after the primaries. But can you talk through what this Iowa poll is and why people have been talking about it?
Yeah, so a big reason that people have been talking about it is that it showed something far outside of what anybody expected.
And to be clear, this was a Seltzer poll that came out on Saturday.
Correct, yes. Jan Seltzer, who's a longtime pollster based in Iowa. You probably heard about her, during the caucuses when her poll is kind of the gold standard, or at least viewed as the gold standard poll. But she comes out with a poll shortly before the election. It measures Iowa's electorate. And as you mentioned, Iowa is not a state that anybody has their eyes on. It's gone reliably red in the Trump era. But it showed something very interesting, which is that Harris led by 3 in a state that Donald Trump won by 8 points in 2020. So that's a big shift from 4 years ago in a way we simply haven't seen in any other polling. And so there is a big question about, does this really kind of strongly well-regarded pollster know something that other pollsters don't? Does this signal some kind of a strength in the Midwest that other polls aren't necessarily picking up on? And we don't know the answer to that question. But if you're a Democrat and you see that, and you've been doubting that this race is necessarily as close as the polls suggest, it gave a lot of people some hope that maybe we could see something a little bit different than the polls have been suggesting for a long time.
After the break, Aaron walks us through one last scenario for an outcome to the election: a tie. We'll be right back. So one last scenario that I just want to touch on briefly: a tie. Because, 538, that's the number of electoral votes that there exist in total, and 538 is an even number. What happens if they get split up between the two of them exactly evenly?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned one scenario in which this could happen, which is that Harris loses Nebraska's 2nd district, but wins the, blue wall states in the north. There's also another scenario involving Trump where he could win 269. If Harris does win Nebraska's 2nd, Trump could win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and either North Carolina or Georgia, and that would get him to exactly 269. It's unlikely, but because we have such a close race, it is more of a possibility than we've seen in the past. So let's say we do have somehow a 269 to 269 tie in the Electoral College. At that point, it would go to the House of Representatives, where each state would vote by congressional delegation. So it's not every member of the House voting. It is each state getting one vote that is decided on by its full delegation. Making this even more complicated is it is not the current House that would be voting, where Republicans have most of the delegations, but it would be the new House. So the House, all these seats are up for election in 2024. The new House will be seated on January 3rd. And after that, on January 6th, is when the House would actually vote in a contingent election and decide who the next president would be.
Well, Aaron, I think that's a good segue to talk about some of the other races that folks should have their eye on Tuesday night and in the days after. And since we're already talking about the House, let's talk about some of those districts that could be important for control of the House going forward. Just describe briefly what's the state of the House right now and what's at stake when folks are seeing, different competitive congressional districts that are going to be coming up red or blue on Tuesday night and on the days following.
Yeah, so the House is probably about as competitive as the presidential race, so it could go either way. Republicans have a very narrow majority, but Democrats can flip the House if they win 4 seats from Republicans. There are 435 congressional districts, but very few of them are actually competitive. Only 22 districts are considered toss-ups by the Cook Political Report, which watches these things very closely. So that's like 1 out of every 20 districts is actually among the most competitive. And the Cook forecast on this suggests that Democrats could gain as much as 10 seats or Republicans could gain as much as 5 seats. Basically, Democrats need to win a slight majority of these toss-up races in order to take over the House. So it could go either way. We usually see the toss-ups go one direction or another. House is very much in play.
And as you're going to be watching the returns, are there any particular seats for the House that you think might be a bellwether for, like, oh, Republicans seem to be doing well tonight and they might hold on to control, or that Democrats seem to have the advantage here, like a seat or a race or a couple candidates in particular?
I think if there are a handful of seats that I'm watching to get a sense for how things are looking. One of them is Scott Perry's seat in Pennsylvania. It's the 10th district. He's a very Trump-oriented Republican, but he comes from a swing district. So if he can survive, that's probably a good sign for Trump. A couple nearby districts that are held by Democrats, including the 7th district held by Susan Wild, the 8th district held by Matt Cartwright. You know, if Republicans can win those seats, that's good for them. But if Democrats are winning those 3 races, they're probably having a good night in Pennsylvania. And if you're having a good night in Pennsylvania, you're having a good election. And then the last one that I would encourage people to keep an eye on is in Maine, the 2nd district, which is where a pretty moderate Democrat, Jared Golden, is trying to win a district that Trump will probably win. That's a very kind of high-profile race and a very big testing ground of whether Democrats can win in tough territory in this election.
Interesting. All right, and then let's talk about the Senate. Obviously, Democrats have control of the Senate right now, but the most narrow control, and I think there's been a lot of doomsday projections about what this election could mean for Democrats maintaining control of the Senate. Talk a little bit about some of the races that you're keeping an eye on when it comes to control of the Senate.
Yeah, so if the House and the presidency are basically a toss-up, I think the Senate is lean Republican. You know, just to break it down a little bit, Democrats currently have a 51-49 majority in the Senate, but because they are likely to lose West Virginia, where Joe Manchin is retiring, we're essentially starting at a 50-50 tie. And 50-50 is, of course, good enough if you win the White House. So if Democrats win the White House, all they need is 50 Senate seats to have a majority because the vice president breaks ties. Same for Republicans. But I think the one thing to watch here is if Harris does win the presidency, that's really the scenario in which the Senate could be undecided at this point. And Democrats are defending a lot of territory. They're having to defend in Ohio, a red state. They're having to defend in Montana, a red state. And so it becomes a situation where Democrats, if Harris wins, they basically have to have all of these races go perfectly in order for them to just hold on to the barest of majorities in the Senate. I would keep an eye on Pennsylvania, where Senator Bob Casey is up for re-election again. Michigan, where there's an open seat. We've got a congresswoman named Alyssa Slotkin running against former Congressman Mike Rogers in Michigan. And then in Wisconsin, you've got Senator Tammy Baldwin trying to hold her seat against Republican Eric Hovde in another very close race that I think a lot of people are keeping an eye on. So Montana and Ohio are the big opportunities for Republicans. Beyond that, I would keep an eye on Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin.
All right, so those are a lot of races for folks to hopefully be keeping an eye out for on Tuesday night and as they see returns come in the following days. But before I let you go, I just want to ask about ballot measures. There are a variety of ballot questions that are facing voters this year. Are there any themes that have come up or groups of ballot questions that you've been following and that you think voters should be paying attention to, even if they're not ballot questions in their state?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought this up because it's something that I think often gets lost on Election Day, but we have an increasing movement in this country to get things done via ballot measure. And a big reason is because a lot of these state legislatures and certainly Congress is a little bit gridlocked. And so these ballot measures give people a way to get things done in another way. A few key ones that I'm watching are, of course, abortion. This is the big one that Democrats have moved to put abortion rights ballot measures on the ballot across a lot of different states. I think there's 10 states with some kind of an abortion rights ballot measure on them. We've seen these abortion right ballot measures pass basically without any exception ever since Roe v. Wade was overturned. So in 2022, the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, and Democrats and abortion rights groups start putting these on the ballot, and they keep winning even in red-leaning states.
Yeah.
So I would expect that could happen in states like Arizona, Colorado, certainly the blue states that are on the ballot, Maryland, New York. But there are some kind of tougher states where this is on the ballot. One of them is South Dakota, another one is Missouri. And then the one I think a lot of people are watching because it is such a high-profile fight is in Florida, where the abortion rights ballot measure is going to get a majority according to the polls, but it needs to get to 60% in order to be effectuated. And so,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, so it's a higher threshold than you usually see in a lot of states, and that's why we've seen a more pitched battle over this, because it's not as assumed that it's going to happen. And of course, this would be very significant because not only is this Donald Trump's home state, and not only has he, tried not to say how he would vote on this until recently, but this is one of those states where they enacted a very strict anti-abortion law, a 6-week ban. And so to the extent that Florida would overturn that with a 60% plus vote, that would be a very significant statement about the march of abortion rights in this country.
Right. And it would just have a huge effect on a lot of people's lives, like not just in Florida, but in all these states. I mean, add them together, we're talking about a significant portion of the country. All right. So, Aaron, any last thoughts? Anything we didn't talk about? Anything that you're going to be paying attention to tonight that you think other people should keep an eye on?
Yeah, I think that we all have our eyes not just on the election results, but what is happening related to them. So are we seeing unrest at the polling places? Are we seeing poll workers be harassed? Certainly, we're all watching to see how Donald Trump and his supporters regard these election results, particularly if Donald Trump loses. We saw after the 2020 election, the Republican movement overwhelmingly lined up behind Trump's false claims of voter fraud and a stolen election and things like that. The party is very much inclined towards those things, but it's a different situation now even a little bit because this is so much more ingrained. Before the 2020 election, Republicans were more concerned about voter fraud, but it hadn't become so central to the party's identity in a way that it is now. And so we're all looking for ways in which this could manifest itself on Election Day, in the days afterward. And I think it's just a really fraught situation for our democracy. So that's certainly something that we're all keeping a very close eye on, in addition to the election results.
That's a really important reminder. Aaron, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through all of this.
Thanks, Martine.
Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter for The Post. He's also my co-host on the Campaign Moment podcast, which you should really follow to understand the results of the election. You can find it wherever you listen to podcasts. Before we go, one last piece of news from Election Day. Some voters are taking extreme measures to avoid the anxiety of this election. Yes, I know that we're all feeling the stress, but one of our colleagues has tracked down folks who have gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid engaging with politics today. Think people fleeing to the woods, locking away their phones, stocking up on cannabis, trying out hypnosis. There's even one woman who strategically timed her colonoscopy to take place today. That is real commitment. If you're listening to this now, it is probably too late to schedule a procedure that will leave you sedated for election night. But we do have some tips on how to manage the stress and uncertainty of this moment. You can find the link in our show notes and at postreports.com. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. The Post is bringing you wall-to-wall election coverage today, so keep a lookout on WashingtonPost.com for any and all updates about the results. We've got a live show you can watch on YouTube later tonight. We've got an elections dashboard updated with the returns from each district as we get them. And of course, we've got podcasts. We'll be dropping a show very early tomorrow morning with the latest on what we know, so listen out for that. Today's show was produced by Ariel Plotnick and Emma Talkoff. It was mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky and Sam Baer. It was edited by Rena Flores, with fact-checking help from Lucy Perkins. Thanks to Mary Jo Murphy, Jenna Johnson, Kathy Decker, Susan Levine, and the whole slew of Post reporters around the country covering this election on the ground, including Laura Benshoff, Holly Bailey, Yvonne Winjet Sanchez, and Josh Dossie. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.